Hello everyone. Today is another matchup chart video, and today's type will be Bug. So Bug is obviously a mid-tierish type, very C-team based, has very good matchups and some very bad matchups, is very volatile as a type in reference to what the list is probably going to look like. But I do have a lot of experience using this type and watching tournament games, using the type myself on the ladder against competitive people like Conflux, Desem, people like that, MPL level players, and I have a lot of input from a lot of other people as well for this list. So without further ado, I'm not saying this is the official MU chart, but it's definitely a very good idea as to what it is and what it looks like in the current metagame. So without further ado, let's start with in alphabetical order for all the types, as we usually do for these kinds of videos, and begin with Dark. So Dark is a very, it's a pretty decent matchup for Bug, because even though it has Urshifu and that thing just kind of clicks buttons against Bug for the most part, especially because it can just click Sucker Punch against like a majority of the cast with Band, while it does do that, webs and certain Pokemon just kind of make it really hard for him to do that sometimes. It does still kind of slightly wall the type, but the type also has Ribombee. Even though Ribombee isn't as common as it used to be, Ribombee still kind of makes this matchup really, really good and in your favor. That being said, though, if you're not running Ribombee, it's probably going to be a little tough because of Mandibuzz is obviously kind of a problem for a Pokemon like Scizor. If it's running Brave Bird, it's even worse. Galvantula and other Pokemon, as I said, get completely offensively run over by Urshifu once it comes in, that is. And there's not really a ton you can do to like beat Urshifu consistently without the use of Ribombee. So because of that, Bug kinda doesn't have that big of a matchup, because if we look at an average Bug team, for example, you'll see that you do have Heracross, which is very, very helpful in dealing with your Shifu, but that thing can get worn down very, very easily. So you do have to be careful, but Heracross is definitely going to be one of the main things that saves your skin in this matchup, and that's why I believe it's still winnable for the general team in Bug, because Heracross is going to be used on Bug regardless of what kind of team it is, because it's one of the best mons on the type. So because of that, you're still going to have a really good matchup against Dark. It's pretty much in your favor, especially, and that's completely ignoring the type advantages and such. But yeah, you will have a pretty decent time beating Dark, because you have Volcarona, who can just run over Dark once it gets a couple of Quiver Dances up. Excuse me. You also have Scizor, who can just click buttons against Dark, but it has to be careful about Urshifu. Ribombee, as I said, can completely decimate the type. You do have to worry a little bit about screens, but screens shouldn't be the worst of your problems, and most offensive types usually have a way to deal with it. Bug is no different, because it just has super effective stab against most of the cast. You do have to be careful about certain Pokemon like Hydreigon, though, because if it does have Scarf, it will outrun and possibly kill your entire team, which is not good, especially if your Volcarona doesn't have a Roost to wall it out with. So with that in mind, you should be careful when going against this type, but for the most part, you should have a good matchup against the average Dark team. And that is all I have to say about that. So without further ado, let's go to Dragon. Dragon used to be a matchup in your favor, because before you used to run Ribombee all the time. It was like one of your best Pokemon. Now that Ribombee is slowly falling out of favor, Dragon is also slowly not being one of your best matchups, because not only does Dragon have access to Toxic Spikes, and even though like almost all your Pokemon ignore Toxic Spikes because of heavy duty boots, the Pokemon that are still affected by it are still pretty hindered by it. And even ignoring that, Dragon is just a much better offensive type and has a lot of dangerous Pokemon like Hydreigon. It's got Haxorus. It's also got Goodra has been rising through the ranks lately. Kyurem is also still a threat. It's still got a bunch of dangerous Pokemon, and it's really, really threatening to deal with. And that's not even mentioning Noivern. But yeah, if you run Raibambi, this matchup is a lot easier. But because the average Bug team doesn't run Raibambi that much anymore, this is more of an even matchup because you still do have crazy Pokemon that can do well in this matchup. Volcarona won't carry you as much this game, but Scizor still kind of clicks buttons against this type a little bit. If they don't have Duraludon, which I've seen a lot of Dragon teams actually dropping Duraludon a lot for Como, for Stealth Rock Setter, and also Duraludon has just been falling out of favor in general because now a lot more teams are focusing on Dragalge Toxic Spikes with Flip Turn, which is very interesting. But aside from that, Bug does enjoy the less usage of Duraludon, even though Duraludon is still common, because now Scizor can just kind of click buttons against the entire type, especially if it's Choice Band, and it just kind of goes to click Bullet Punch on whatever it wants, and most Dragon types in this metagame are pretty frail, so it can usually pick up a lot of KOs, especially after rocks and webs and all that nonsense. So yeah, Dragon kind of even, especially with Heracross helping out quite a bit against certain Pokemon, but it still can be kind of a iffy matchup, especially because of Hydreigon and how dangerous it is on its own. But yeah, it can be a very iffy matchup. That's ignoring, of course, Araquanid, and I forgot to mention this in the Dark MU as well, but the reason why Hydreigon doesn't completely run you over is because Araquanid exists and is becoming slowly a staple on Bug. It was mainly getting run to deal with water, as we'll talk about later, but yeah, that mon will be coming up a lot more in the future types that we talk about. So Dragon, for now, it is a decent matchup. It's not one of your favorites though. And there's no really volatility to it. There's no win condition, per se, for either type, really. It's just a matter of who can offensively pressure the other player better. And it does have a slight edge towards Dragon, but I feel like Bug, because it has the option to run Raibambi, and because that option is still pretty strong, I'd still say it's an even matchup. So, if you don't have Raibambi, though, I would say it might be -1. But because Raibambi is still an option that's not terrible, it's an even matchup. But the lack of Raibambi and its presence in the metagame definitely has hurt this matchup quite a bit. Next up, we have Electric. Electric is definitely not a good matchup for you. And here's why. So, Raichu Alola in Electric terrain can just click buttons against your entire type. There's not much that your type can really do about it, because you can use Wakan Berry Araquanid as some sort of countermeasure, but that won't save you all the time, especially if you consider Spikes Chip, a Toxic Spikes Chip, Raichu just not clicking Rising Voltage or using Psychic instead. Even if you click Liquidation, it won't kill 100% of the time, and Leech Life isn't going to do enough. It's just a lot of things that can go wrong in that matchup, and it's not exactly pleasant for either player to deal with. Well, for the Bug player to deal with. Also, Scizor can't carry you. Volcarona can potentially win the game, but that's if Raichu has been dealt with. Otherwise, Raichu just completely runs over Volcarona. And because of the volatility of how Electric can just instantly win off of a few good offensive turns, I'd say the matchup is not in your favor. That being said, though, you can still win this matchup, and that's why it's not -2, because you have Volcarona who can still win the entire game because of Electric's lack of good, well, not lack of anything, but because Electric is still pretty weak to Volcarona plus Webs, which is still a really powerful combo, and Electric doesn't really have a solid way of getting rid of those hazards either, so that's also very helpful. I mean, they do have Emolga and such, and they also have Morpeko, but those aren't super good methods of dealing with getting rid of hazards, and most teams don't usually run it. So because of that, it's still winnable, but it's not very easy for you to win at all, especially because Raichu is such a threat. But if you get rid of Raichu, the matchup becomes a little bit easier, but still not completely in your favor. And because of that, I'd say it's a -1. Otherwise, it'd be even. And this has always historically been a thing, even before in Gen 7. Electric kind of always kind of ran over Bug pretty hard. Because Raichu Lola, even without Rising Voltage, still kind of just clicked buttons against your entire type. Granted, not as much as it did before because Electric Terrain was banned, but Tapu Koko was also kind of a big deal and such, so Electric has always kind of had an advantage against Bug. So don't think this is just a new gen thing. It's always been a thing. But yeah, next type we'll talk about is Fairy. Fairy is slightly advantageous. Now, you might be thinking, oh, but Namornan, there's Heracross. Heracross is on your team and it's weakened by a lot of the fairy types. Yeah, but that's one Pokemon that might not be doing anything in the matchup. You still have the biggest threat to fairy of all time, which is Scizor. And Scizor literally clicks, like, it just brain dead clicks Bullet Punch. You can't go wrong by clicking Bullet Punch on Scizor, unless there's a Clefable, or even an Azumarill. But yeah, this matchup is pretty easy. I would say it's +2, but it can go wrong if you don't play around Azumarill properly, because then Azumarill can easily reverse sweep you, especially with screens plus webs and all that. If you run Araquanid, it becomes a little bit easier, because Araquanid can obviously use Liquidation, Leech Life, even Poison Jab if you specifically don't want to lose to Azumarill, because it does resist Aqua Jet pretty well, thanks to Water Bubble, but it's still really rough if Azumarill does get set up. Assuming Azumarill doesn't get the chance to set up, though, which can be pretty difficult because Klefki can kind of just set screens whenever it wants to. Assuming you don't let Azumarill get a free turn to set up, this matchup is very much in your favor because of that. So yeah, not really much else I can say. Scizor just kind of wins the matchup. Volcarona is also a really big threat in the matchup as well, if you accidentally kill Scizor for whatever reason. But yeah, between Volcarona, Scizor, and just the overall pressure you put on Fairy in general, I'd say it's a pretty good matchup. Pretty good matchup for you. Not +2, it's not brain dead easy, but it's definitely in your favor for most of the game. Just be careful with the Azumarill because it can go wrong. Fighting. So, I think we talked about this matchup before against Fighting, and I'd say this matchup is still very much even, because Fighting kinda just doesn't do a ton to you, because it does have Terrakion, obviously, which is probably one of the biggest threats to your team. Actually, yeah, it's definitely -1 because of Terrakion. Terrakion's a really big deal. Also, Scizor, Keldeo just spitting Hydro Pumps at you. Very rough, very, very rough. Yeah, Scizor can't really carry you this matchup because of Keldeo, and Keldeo's obviously going to still click Hydro Pump against your entire team, except for Araquanid, for obvious reasons. I'd still say you can frustrate Fighting very well because you have access to webs, and Ribombee is also a thing that exists, so webs plus Ribombee is almost like Fighting clicks X to that, kind of, sorta. So, I'd say against the average Fighting team, you probably will have a good advantage against it. Also, if you use Shuckle on your Bug team as your main web setter, there's nothing Fighting can do to stop you. You do have to be careful about Hawlucha, though, and there's a bunch of other problematic Pokemon that can just cause really big issues with your team, so because of that, I would say it's -1. But it is very possible for you to win, especially if you use Ribombee. But Fighting is definitely not a type you want to see, especially if it has Hawlucha and Terrakion, which are the most common Pokemon on the type right now. So just be careful when you're dealing with this type, because it's probably not going to end well for you, especially if they're good. Alright, next up we got Fire. So you absolutely cannot do anything about Fire in this generation. And even with Centiskorch before Volcarona came, this matchup was pretty much unwinnable. There is nothing you could do. Sure, you switched into like a couple of fire moves, but like those same fire move users have access to Rocky Slide, and Scizor wasn't even in the game back then. Neither was Heracross, so you had no neutrality to that move. You just kind of ate rock slides for breakfast. So yeah, you just kind of got clicked on for the most part, and yeah, back then it was still really bad, and now it's even worse because Cinderace has Libero, which means it can change its stab whenever it wants to from fire, meaning that Araquanid cannot check it solidly enough, and bulk upsets are just an absolute pain in the butt to deal with. So, for those reasons, I will say that this is definitely just a type you click X to. There's nothing you can really do to win. Uh, Even with Araquanid, you still really can't win against fire because, as I said before, there's a bunch of Rock Slide users. Araquanid can obviously get worn down very easily, and as long as they keep Cinderace healthy, there's not really much you can do about it. And Cinderace always runs heavy duty boots, so you can't even slow that thing down with webs. Volcarona can't really sweep the matchup for you because fire resists both of its stabs, and Psychic is not going to do enough. Scizor obviously gets hard walled by basically every fire type on the team. Heracross, while it does have access to Stone Edge, is outsped by basically every Scarfer on fire. Charizard, Darmanitan. It's just not a good look. And even if you do use webs to slow those guys down, you still have to worry about getting worn down by rocks yourself, and also dealing with the ever so present Torkoal, who forces out your Shuckle and always rapid spins. So thank you, Windows, very cool, but always forces you out with rapid spin and yawn, and there's basically not a lot you can do about it. You can try and encore Torkoal the first turn, but it's still not very good because Torkoal kind of just sits on your entire team except for maybe Araquanid. But yeah, it's not a good matchup. It's terrible. I really can't even give good advice to how you can possibly win this. It is very, very, very unlikely. Your opponent has to both play bad and you have to have ridiculous C-team potential to actually win this matchup because it is extremely hard to win. So, because of that, it's a click X type, and there's not really much you can do about it, unfortunately. Flying. Flying is not a good matchup at all. So beyond the obvious reasons, and you might be thinking, oh, but we have Galvantula. They literally can't do anything about that. And you are right, they can't do anything about Galvantula. But offensively, they can still take you out because they have access to Scarf Charizard, who's obviously a really big threat to you on the fire matchup, and is still a big threat to you now. And beyond that, they also have Corviknight, who's also a pain in the neck to deal with. They also have Gyarados, who's a pain in the neck to deal with. They have a lot of Pokemon that just happen to be really big pain in the necks for Bug to deal with. And in general, you're just probably not going to have a good time facing them. Both Balance and HO archetypes are just completely stopped by... No, they're not completely stopped, but they completely stop you from doing anything. Because even with Pokemon like Heracross and stuff, you just cannot get an opening in on that defensive core or even the offensive core. And they will almost always just click Air Slash on you, and they can just get away with it. There's not much you can do about it. And because Scizor isn't as bulky as it was last gen with its Mega Evolution, you really, really can't do anything about it. You don't offensively pressure them enough, and even though you do have Galvantula, that can do work potentially, and I won't lie, that is probably the only reason this isn't a Click X type. But because you have to rely solely on one Pokemon and one Pokemon alone to win this matchup, that is not a good look. It's winnable. It's not very winnable. It's very hard to win with this type as Bug. Against this type as Bug. But it's possible, and because it's possible and actually plausibly possible, it's -2 for that reason. But it's a very rough matchup. It's not as hard, it's not as impossible as Fire, but it's definitely extremely rough. I think it's one of the few low tier types that you'll actually have a very bad time against. Ghost. Ghost is a pretty odd story. So, you do kind of beat out most of the Pokemon on Ghost. Well, you don't beat them out, but Volcarona does threaten like a majority of the Ghost type, because obviously Corsola can't do anything to you. Corsola can't do anything to you. They don't really have a lot of other good offensive attackers besides. Oh wait, never mind. You have Marowak Alola, completely walls Volcarona. Uh, there's just a lot of volatility in this matchup because you have Marowak Alola. Ghost has Marowak Alola, is just an absolute pain in the neck to deal with. Well, once you deal with that thing, Volcarona just kind of takes over the matchup, if you will. So it's a pretty rough story of how this matchup can go. I'd say it's even, purely because here, let's look at the Ghost team real quick because my memory may be failing me, but I'm pretty sure Volcarona does just beat most of the Ghost. So yeah, ignoring that balanced Ghost team, we do have pretty decent idea of the Pokemon that Ghost has access to. So Aegislash obviously gets destroyed by Volcarona. Dragapult is definitely a big problem, and I didn't even talk about that in the Dragon matchup, but yeah, Dragapult's kind of really annoying for you to deal with, but thankfully Scizor does revenge kill it most of the time. But yeah, even with Heracross and Scarf Heracross with knockoff doing quite a bit of work against Ghost, you still have to worry about Mimikyu being an absolute pain in the neck that it is, and it's just a weird matchup. It's not even like it's bad for either side. It's just a really weird matchup for the average teams on both sides. Especially since Chandelure has seen less usage. I would have said that it was -1 back when Chandelure was popular, but Chandelure has declined in usage recently because Marowak Alola has been released. So, and because Marowak Alola is a little easier to deal with than Chandelure, a little, not a lot, but a little easier to deal with, it's definitely a +0 kind of matchup. Definitely even. I can't really say it's a very good matchup because I have done this matchup before against an unviable team, that is. But excuse me, but it is really awkward. Extremely awkward. There's no win conditions, but it's extremely volatile. And because of that, I'll say it's even, but this is definitely one of the weirder types you'll face. So I would highly recommend if you plan on using Bug like really much on the ladder, try and make sure you know how to deal with Ghost because that'll help you a lot due to Ghost being a really popular type. Be careful with Dragapult, obviously, because Fire Blast spam, even though Araquanid deals with that. And also just be really smart about how you set up your setup sweepers, namely Volcarona. Also, Ghost doesn't have hazard removal, so keep that in mind. Next up we have Grass. So Grass, obviously a winnable matchup. Actually, I'd say it's +2. The reason I say it's +2 is because not even just Volcarona, just like almost all the Pokemon on your team kind of do big work against Grass. So you got Scizor, who can just U-turn on the entire type and wear him down very easily. You got Volcarona, who just literally clicks Quiver Dance the one chance it gets, and just kind of destroys the entire type. You got Heracross, who can outspeed a majority of Grass and just click Mega Horn for free. Araquanid also just takes most of Grass's hits thanks to its neutrality, and it can just click Leech Life whenever it wants to. It can also just take one of Celebi's hits and just dish back damage with Mirror Coat. It's literally like the game was designed to make Bug win versus Grass, and it's kind of crazy that that's the case. Sungrass, on the other hand, is pretty annoying, I would say. Definitely very annoying. But because Araquanid is such a good Pokemon at dealing with that, as long as you don't get sleep powdered, I would say that it's still pretty easy to deal with. That being said, though, Rillaboom is also obviously a threat because most of Bug is very frail. But as I also said before, you have Volcarona, so yeah, it's still a very easy matchup to win. I wouldn't say you should feel really bad if you lose it, because it is potentially losable because it's a little volatile. Not a very extremely volatile, but it's a little volatile. But you should still pretty much win this matchup. Don't feel bad if you lose it, though, because Grass can have some really odd tech to deal with Bug because it is one of its worst matchups. So you do want to be careful, but it should just know that in general you should have a pretty easy time against Grass, so long as you use Volcarona properly. All right, next up we got Ground. Now, Ground is a pretty odd matchup. So, you obviously have Excadrill, who can just kind of click Rock Slide against your entire team and just kind of get away with that for free. And then you also have Hippowdon, who just kind of walls your entire team, besides, like, obviously, Giga Drain and such. But, Giga Drain on Volcarona, that is. But, it's pretty weird. So you don't really have that good of a matchup against them because usually you have most of your Pokemon are just like Galvantula, for example, like gets his other stab walled. He does have access to Energy Ball, but Energy Ball doesn't do that much to Ground, despite what you may think. But yeah, also has Flygon, who can just kind of eat most of Bug's hits and just like throw itself at it essentially, and just kind of just pick up kills like that. Special Flygon also is actually kind of a threat, but even if it's not special, Physical Flygon is actually more of a threat to Bug because you don't really have a physical wall due to the fact that you're not running hazard removal. Also, Armaldo and Fortress are obviously not in the game yet, but I still do think that this matchup is pretty much in Ground's favor. Even though Bug does resist Ground Stab, obviously, it's still not very. That's not as much of an advantage as you would think it is, mainly because almost every single ground type has a rock move, or at least access to a rock move. And even though most of the ground types don't run it, Excadrill is still like a really big reason why you don't want to deal with it. Now, obviously, you can still win this matchup, especially if you somehow manage to kill Hippowdon. It's very hard to do that, but it is plausible that you can do it, and Volcarona can just kind of set up against Hippowdon and just click Giga Drain, slowly wearing it down, and Excadrill has to click Rock Slide almost every single time because any other move would just result in Volcarona instantly winning the game. And that in general is just not a good thing for Ground to have. So Ground does have to stay on its toes because you have Volcarona, but aside from that, it is still very much a matchup that's in their favor. Don't expect this to be easy to win or to be very fair for you to win. Next up, we have Ice. So Ice is also a winnable matchup. You got Scizor, you got Heracross, you got Volcarona. Need I say more? This matchup used to be a little bit more even back in the day, but now it's just kind of over the top, very, very easy to win. But I would say you should still be careful because they do still have Galarian Darmanitan, and that mod is still obviously a big threat because it just kind of clicks buttons against your entire team except for maybe Araquanid. Actually, yeah, it just doesn't click buttons against Araquanid at all, but Araquanid will get worn down, so you can't rely on that all the time. But yeah, Scizor obviously crushes this entire type, and Avalugg did get a little bit buffed in regards to how it can deal with Scizor, but it's still not enough. And you will still have a pretty easy time just clicking Bullet Punch against them. Just make sure you're not too reckless with Scizor, otherwise you're going to lose. And that's why I'd say it's +1, because it's not like super brain dead easy, but it's still easy enough that it's just like you shouldn't have to worry about this matchup at all. Sandslash is also kind of a threat, so even though that mod isn't super good, Sandslash is just like kind of eh. Also has access to Rock Slide, I'm pretty sure. But even with access to Rock Slide, it's still not going to do that much to you. And it's mediocre in general, so you don't have to worry about it that much. But yeah, just know that Ice is pretty much in your favor. You shouldn't have to worry about it. Now we have Normal. So Normal is an odd one. So you have to worry about Indeedee clicking Expanding Force against your entire team. That's obviously a big problem, But once you get those webs down, if the normal team doesn't have access to hazard removal, as we talked about it last time, Bug can just kinda click buttons against the entire type, because Heracross just literally sweeps the entire type with ease once you put down webs. But you do have to be careful because it only has 8 uses of close combat, and you may think like, oh, well that shouldn't matter because like I'll just sweep the entire type with that stab. Like, no, it will matter. You have to be careful with that. And also they have access to Ditto, which can stop your sweep at any time and make you waste a very vital close combat, because you need to 2-hit KO those walls with close combat. So Chansey and Porygon 2 don't get O-Code at all. You have to use it twice on them. So that's 4 PP just for those two. And then you have the other offensive Pokemon that you have to worry about. And you still have to worry about Ditto, who can just eat one of your CCs at any time. So because of that dangerous game, and because you get absolutely walled otherwise, this is a pretty even matchup, I'd say. You do have the upper hand, don't get me wrong, you have the upper hand because you have Heracross, so you can just kind of take a Pokemon, and you can wear Ditto down a lot. So that's why it's not, like, terrible, but I'd say it's still pretty rough, because Volcarona also doesn't win this matchup for you, thanks to the fact that Chansey completely walls it and wears it down. You also have to worry about Porygon 2 walling Scizor, who can click Superpower against the entire type pretty easily too. Even if Ditto comes in, it still takes a really big chunk of damage. And wearing that thing down enough will definitely help you in the long run, but Porygon 2 actually does switch into it and can recover off of it, so that's not ideal either. It doesn't. If you have knockoff though, this matchup becomes a lot easier because the Eevee-like core can't work as effectively. Ditto can lose its Choice Scarf, and Heracross will be able to deal with that thing easier because of that. But yeah, the matchup is not super easy, and if they have a flying type, it's a bad time. It's a very bad time. But yeah, the matchup is still pretty volatile, I would say. Pretty volatile. You can win. It's very possible for you to win. You just have to be careful with Psychic Terrain being up all the time when you're clicking Bullet Punch or U-Turn or whatever you're clicking on Scizor. You also have to be careful with how you play your Heracross. But I'd say it's like the highest of the even matchups. It's definitely +1 if played properly, but because you have to constantly think, it's not nearly as like brain dead easy to win these matchups. Like Ice Fairy and Dark, you don't have to think nearly as much about beating these types. You don't have to think nearly as much about beating those types as you do when you have to face normal. So because of that, I'd say it's an even matchup because you have to constantly make sure that you don't make a mistake. And it's very easy for you to make a mistake as well. So because of that, it's an even matchup. Otherwise, it would absolutely be +1. Poison. So Poison is also a pretty even matchup, I would say. Toxapex is obviously a humongous problem for bug teams. Because Volcarona lost C-moves, you don't have Psychium Z to deal with it anymore, and Galvantula obviously gets worn down very easily. So, and because there's so many things that just wall Galvantula outright, it's not very easy to wear down Toxapex at all, and it kind of just clicks Toxic against your entire team because you don't really have a reliable Steel type to switch into it. And even if you switch into Scizor, you have to worry about getting Scalded and getting Scald Burned, and it's just in general not a very good matchup. That being said though, you can still be a threat with Volcarona if they make a mistake, for example, but I'd say the matchup is not in your favor at all. Especially with Amoonguss now putting one thing to sleep. You just kind of get walled out by Toxapex, and Toxapex and its friends just kind of just wear you down slowly and beat you up. Not really much else to say. Just Toxapex, Amoonguss, Drapion slash Skuntank. I think Skuntank a lot more now. Also, Salazzle absolutely wrecks your behind. So this matchup is definitely not in your favor. Would not suggest using this type against poison. Psychic. Psychic is not very good. So you would think that, oh, well, Bug is super effective against Psychic. Clearly, it's a winning matchup. Not at all. Not at all. See, this is Monotype, and when you build a team, you have to build the best team possible. And Psychic, you would think it would have to run something to deal with Bug. Not at all. Not in this generation, because thanks to Indeedee and Choice Scarf and Expanding Force, it does not have to worry about much. That being said, though, you still do have to worry a lot about webs. At least offensive Psychic has to worry a lot about webs, but balanced Psychic not so much. Because Slowbro obviously is still like a big thing that your team has to deal with. The Rocky Helmet can wear down Sizor very easily, so it can't just spam U-turn all the time. You also have to worry about Alakazam potentially just completely destroying your Sizor as well, or your Heracross. That thing just literally comes in anytime it wants. So basically, the situation is Slowbro comes in on one of your Pokemon, it clicks Teleport, and basically gets Alakazam in for free. If you SD with your Sizor, or you just click U-turn or Bullet Punch with your Sizor, Slowbro just switches out into Alakazam, basically forcing Sizor out, unless you want to lose your Sizor that turn. And losing your Sizor would mean that you basically have an Indeedee that can just do whatever it wants. Also, Psychic has access to Hatterene, who basically completely stops your hazard game. Like, absolutely completely stops it. Because Shuckle can't do anything about that. And as I said before, Hatterene can just switch out to Slowbro at any time, and then Slowbro just teleports and causes all that nonsense. So, against Mountain Psychic, you absolutely get thrashed. Even against offensive Psychic, a lot of offensive Psychic teams have Hatterene on them, so you still will not have a good time. And because you yourself don't have any hazard removal, that is going to end up with a lot of bad things happening to you. Now, granted, you don't need hazard removal because of heavy-duty boots, but it doesn't matter. The Pokemon that are affected by it, like Galvantula, for example, Galvantula, Sizor, and Heracross are all going to get worn down a lot, especially by webs and Stealth Rock. So, because of the fact that Hatterene can just kind of sit on your type, and because of the fact that Psychic can just kind of click buttons against you the entire time, this matchup is not easy to win at all. I'd arguably say it's -2, but the reason I'm keeping it at -1 is because you do have a natural advantage against it, and Volcarona is still a very big threat to this type. Because despite how much I talk about Hatterene being a big threat, Hatterene also gets threatened by Volcarona equally. If they're not Calm Mind, that is. A non-Calm Mind Hatterene will get beaten out by Volcarona, even though most of them tend to be Calm Mind nowadays. But Volcarona can still find a switch in at any time, like against Alakazam. And if you run Volcarona or Volcarona with Roost, you basically have a very easy time against Psychic, like extremely easy. So because of Volcarona and like Araquanid in some cases, like Araquanid can absolutely like sit on Indeedee sometimes and just click Mirror Coat whenever it wants to. Because I believe it does take an Expanding Force, if I'm not mistaken. Let me check. Araquanid. That's weird. That set isn't on here. Let's see. So let me look at the set we have for the standard bug team. Let me nickname this real quick so I can find it. So now we got Araquanid versus what were we talking about again? Indeedee. No, not you. Alright, so we're just going to make this 120 base power. In psychic terrain, and yeah, Araquanid does take a expanding force from Indeedee in psychic terrain, so that's pretty good. Huh. Wow, it really does take it. That's kind of surprising. But yes, excuse me. Yes, this Pokemon does very much beat out wall. Excuse me, cannot speak. This Pokemon does wall Indeedee and other special attackers, and can click Mirror Coat and just do a lot of damage back to them. So because of those reasons and the reasons I mentioned before, this isn't the worst matchup, but it's still not in your favor at all. Should be very worried about it. All right, next up we got Rock. Rock gets absolutely crushed by you. Now, you would think, oh, Rock completely destroys this, right? Not really. So, you have access to two Pokemon that completely beat Rock teams. You have Heracross, and you have Scizor. Heracross can literally click buttons against the entire type with absolutely no problem. Just has to worry about Lunatone and possibly being outsped by that. But aside from that, absolutely no issues. And then you just have to worry about Lycanroc potentially clicking Accelerock against you and claiming a kill. Scizor also clicks buttons against the entire type, just clicks Bullet Punch whenever it wants to, except for maybe Colossal and Rhyperior. And while those two are usually very good natural checks to that Pokemon, you still have other Pokemon like Galvantula that can just click Energy Ball at any time. You have other Pokemon like Araquanid that can just click Liquidation at any time as well. Doesn't really matter what you do, you just kind of get clicked on. Rock just kind of gets clicked on the entire time, so it's not very easy for them to deal with you at all, which is very funny because of the fact that Rock should really have a decent matchup against Bug, but it's actually not one of their best. I would say on Rock's end it's even, but for you it's probably a good matchup just because you have Scizor and Heracross, and that's not even including the fact that you have Webs and Rocks. Yeah, Rock can't really keep up with you. At worst it's even, but most of the times you probably will win this matchup. Don't feel bad if you lose it though. Next up we have Steel. Absolutely, you just win. Steel kind of clicks X against you because you have Excadrill. No, you don't have Excadrill, but you have Volcarona, and literally Steel has no way to deal with Volcarona at all. There is zero way for them to deal with this mon. No, they can't deal with it. They really just cannot deal with it. This, Volcarona alone literally made Steel less of a viable type because of how good it is against it. So yeah, Volcarona literally wins this for you, and there's no reason you shouldn't be using Volcarona. Why would you be giving up 2 free matchups just from not using Volcarona and possibly just winning other matchups for no reason? The mon is just so good that it literally wins 2 matchups on its own. It's crazy. But yeah, Steel absolutely sucks against Volcarona, but let's put in an imaginary world where you may have lost your Volcarona. You still do have Scizor that can just click Superpower. You still have Heracross. That's obviously still a big threat. Even if they send out Aegislash, you can just go back into Volcarona, or you can just switch out into Araquanid. Doesn't really matter. The fact of the matter is, you just kind of Volcarona just completely wins this matchup for you, and there's no reason you shouldn't be using that mod. You still have other things to help you win, but Volcarona just decimates the entire type. There's just not much they can do about it once it gets a Quiver Dance up, and it's not hard to do that either. If you ever see Ferrothorn claim a kill against any of your Pokemon, you basically have just already won the game, because you just put in Volcarona, click Quiver Dance, Flame move away. There is nothing they can do. Do note versus Steel though, you have to be careful with your webs. So you would think, oh, I want to put down webs so I can slow down Excadrill. Yes, but don't, because if they have a Bisharp, that matchup, that extremely easy matchup, will turn into a +0 matchup because Bisharp will literally come in on webs every single time and threaten to KO one of your Pokemon with Sucker Punch, and that is not good. Heracross doesn't take a hit very well from a +2 Bisharp at all, and if it's LO, it's even worse. So yeah, you want to like not deal with that. So yeah, don't set webs versus steel, and this is a +2 matchup. If you set webs though, you're literally making it much worse for yourself. So just don't, because Volcarona outspeeds Excadrill +1 anyway, and you will get a +1 easily. So please, just don't set webs against this type. I've seen so many players make that mistake. Don't do it. Just put up rocks and be done with it. Now we have water. So water is one of the more interesting matchups. So you do lose against this type because Hurricane Kingdra exists, and there's not much you can do about it. Araquanid can take a hit from Kingdra though, and Mirror Coat. But what about Surging Strikes or Shifu? And that is the main problem you will have. Also, Aqua Jet or Shifu doesn't help either. You got Seismitoad to deal with. You do have Galvantula, which is why this isn't a Click X type. Because there's counterplay. There's counterplay, but it's very hard for that counterplay to actually work effectively against a good opponent. So, for that reason, water is definitely one of Bug's worst matchups. It can just kind of spam water moves against you, even though you have Araquanid. It does get worn down by Stealth Rock if Seismitoad does use it. And like I said, you do have Galvantula, which is definitely one of the best Pokemon to deal with water, because it has access to both Thunder, which takes advantage of rain, and also has Energy Ball to deal with water grounds. Seismitoad, I think, has been running enough health to take one of those. I think offensive Seismitoads don't run enough, but basically, if they send in Pelipper, they're basically in a 50-50, and they're on the back foot. And if you play your mind out and play absurdly well with your Galvantula and your Araquanid, this matchup is definitely doable. But if you don't do that, which is what most of you are probably going to do, because it's very hard to play immaculately with Bug, you're probably going to lose, because the type will just run you over, or Shifu will just click Aqua Jet and Surging Strikes against your entire team. It's not good. It's not a good matchup at all, and I would really suggest you avoid this matchup like the plague, because it's not fun. It's not as bad as Fire, but it's still not fun to deal with. And without further ado, that is the end of my Bug matchup chart. As you can see, Bug does not have a lot of good matchups, but some of the types that it does have great matchups against are some common types. Like Fairy, for example, is definitely a good type to have a good matchup against. Also, Steel is a good type to have a good matchup against. Dark is also a good matchup to have a good type to have a good matchup against. Excuse me. But yeah, it has very good matchups against very good types, but it also has really bad matchups against very good types. So it's not exactly one of the best types matchup-wise, but if you're fishing for one of those MUs, it will absolutely give you a great reward for doing so. So without further ado, I would say that is the end of this video. So if you liked it, comment, subscribe, do whatever you want. This has been Nambernan, and I hope you all have a great day.